I mention all of that because just as we have to wait many times in our everyday lives, we often also have to wait in our spiritual lives as well. In fact, waiting in the Bible, it seems, is standard operating procedure, and it has been the history of God's people. In fact, there are over 130 instances of waiting in the Bible. This morning, we are kicking off our new sermon series titled Waiting On, and specifically today, we're going to be looking at waiting on God to respond. Waiting on God to respond. And it's quite appropriate that we would take a look at this whole issue at this particular time, because you see, we are vastly quickly approaching the Advent and Christmas season of the year. That word Advent means coming. It refers to Jesus was promised to come, he came, and he is coming back again. But then we would logically want to know when. When is Christ coming back? Well, only the Father in heaven knows, and so we're waiting on God to respond. And even though we can become impatient at times, maybe even get irritated by many of the little things that we have to wait for in this life, God's people can also become impatient. We can also become frustrated when we have to wait on God to respond. You know, after Adam and Eve first sinned and brought sin into the world, God responded right away. Because the very same day that sin came into the world, he made the promise of our Savior. It's in Genesis 3:15. And then right away in chapter 4, according to St. Jerome's Vulgate translation of the Bible, verse 1 in chapter 4 talks about how Eve had her first child. And then she says, look, I've had the Lord. So for Eve, waiting for the promised Savior, that wasn't on her radar at all. But the history of God's people throughout the Old Testament is one of waiting for the fulfillment of the promised Messiah, the Savior of the world. And God's prophets, a prophet is a spokesperson for God, and God's prophets, they called on God's people to be faithful during this time of waiting for the promise of the Savior to be fulfilled.